In 2008, the National Institutes of Health conducted a study where they compared the brains of rich kids with the brains of poor kids, and what they found was astounding. The brains of poor kids had been damaged to the extent that they resembled that of adult stroke victims. And the part of their brains that were impacted the most was the prefrontal cortex, and that's responsible for advanced thinking, judgment, and impulse control, and it's involved in the storage and the retrieval of memories. So science was showing us that the link between low socioeconomic status and poor academic achievement had absolutely nothing to do with a lack of motivation in these kids. It had to do with the fact that their brains have been profoundly impacted by poverty and inequality. We've been told for the longest time that societies based on competition, individualism, and inequality are the typical capitalist economies, that these are the best societies to get people to reach their fullest potential. In fact, the more competition and inequality a society has, we've been told that's what gives the incentive for people to bring themselves up from the bottom and pull themselves up by their bootstraps to make it to the middle class or beyond. But that's just not so. In fact, more equal societies do far better on a whole range of issues, including academic achievement, but they also have less violent crime, less family violence. And these societies, people have a longer life expectancy and they live healthier and happier lives. If you're not aware of the number of children in the United States that are poor, or what the federal poverty level is for that matter, you're not alone. Most Americans don't know that 1 in 5 children in this country are growing up in poverty, and that the federal poverty level is $24,000 for a family of 4. I live on Long Island. You can't survive as a family of 2 for $24,000 a year, let alone 4 people. And experts have said that the poverty level itself is half what it should be. It should be twice that in order for families to have what they need to get their basic necessities met. And if we do set the level of poverty more accurately, more than 2 in 5 kids in the United States would be considered poor. As it stands now, more than half the kids who graduate high school have been on food stamps at some point in their lives. And poverty is a leading cause of death in the United States. More people die because of poverty and inequality than because of heart disease or strokes or even drug overdoses. So it's the inequality that is actually creating a state of chronic stress that is damaging the developing bodies and brains of these kids. And it's not just what's happening in the home. When we look at what's happening in the neighborhoods, they're places of high risk as well. Being born low socioeconomic status raises the risk for a whole bunch of things. There was a study done in 2011, and it showed that for every 1% rise in home foreclosures, there was a corresponding 3 to 5% increase in the amount of hospital admissions for severe physical abuse of children, including head trauma. And some of those kids died. So what it showed was that growing up in poor households actually increased your risk for child abuse and neglect. Now, it's not that those parents don't love their children, they absolutely do, but the level of stress that parents of low socioeconomic status are under on a daily basis makes parenting to their best potential very, very difficult. And the Centers for Disease Control showed very clearly in their Adverse Childhood Experiences study that the more abuse and neglect a child had growing up, the more risk they would have of having poorer health outcomes throughout their lives. More likely it would be that their neurological development would be impacted. They're more likely to have anxiety, depression, mental illness, and addiction throughout their lives. But even their physical bodies are affected by the stress to the point where they're more likely to have heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. See, the story of risk, whether it's from low socioeconomic status or the corresponding risk of child maltreatment in those homes, is the story of chronic stress. Our stress levels are meant to go up and come down quickly so that we can get away from a threat. But kids who are growing up low socioeconomic status, they're in a state of survival mode all the time. And it's not just their homes. They grow up in neighborhoods that have risk. I live in Huntington, Long Island, and like many towns across the United States, Huntington is a tale of 2 cities. There is a middle class and upper class area, mostly white, and then there are pockets of poverty where low socioeconomic status families live, often black and brown, and some immigrants. So what we have is this tale of two cities. A colleague of mine works for a youth center, and she asked the kids to describe their neighborhoods, and to do it by using words that describe their sights and sounds. The kids in the middle-class neighborhoods described seeing lush green lawns and looking at beautiful homes, hearing the ice cream truck as it rolled down the street in the summer, which they thought was a very exciting thing, but I find infuriating at 9 in the morning on a Saturday. But the kids in the poor neighborhoods, they talked about seeing people pushing their belongings in shopping carts, boarded up houses, police all the time in their neighborhood. And when the police go to those neighborhoods, usually it's not for a good reason. And the sounds they heard were gunshots. A few years ago in Huntington Station, they had to close the intermediate school because of a drive-by shooting. So you can imagine the kids growing up with the risk of income inequality in their homes. When they leave the door to go to school, that risk doesn't stop. It's amazing that they achieve it all, and they do. But we're creating a world for them where people are seeing themselves down here and others up here. There was a famous study done in India where they took boys from the highest caste and the lowest caste, and they brought them together in a room. They didn't know which caste each other was from, and they had them complete these puzzles, these little mazes. And when they finished the first round of tests, their scores were identical. And then they each stood up, and they said what town they were from, and they said what caste they were in, and they took the tests again. And the boys from the highest caste did better, and the boys from the lowest caste, their grades sunk. So it's not just growing up in poverty that creates stress. It's feeling like you're down here when others are up here. And right now in the United States, we've got the widest gap between the rich and the poor than we've ever had since the Great Depression. And when I think about how we've made people to feel like the other, I can't have this conversation without talking about racism too. Now, I'm having that conversation as a person of privilege, born white, male, and middle class. And I didn't ask for that privilege, but I've been given it much of my life without even knowing that I had it. And when we look at race, racism also does raise the risk for poverty, because a black or brown child in the United States born today is twice as likely to grow up poor. But it's not just income inequality which causes the chronic stress of racism, because even middle class and upper class black and brown people have higher risk of poorer health outcomes. And that's because of the risk of the chronic stress associated with racism. It's because when people are treated like they are here and others are treated in a place of privilege, it sets up a system where people are more likely than not having to work so hard not to fail. And I am not suggesting that black and brown children or children of poverty don't succeed or achieve. They do, and they achieve great things. But it's not lost on me that when they do, they have worked far harder than I've ever had to work because of my privilege. And that's not okay. So we need to eradicate income inequality, but at the same time, we have to end systemic and institutional racism. And people who are in positions of privilege have to stand up and make that their fight. And those things have to happen together. I wasn't in Ferguson the day that Mike Brown was shot and killed. So I don't know what happened that day. But I do know that when his body lay in the street, under the August sun, covered only by a sheet for 4.5 hours, while his family and friends and neighbors looked on, helpless. Intentional or not, that sent a very clear message that their lives were not as valuable as the lives of people who look like me. And that's not acceptable. We are not going to live in the world we were promised until we do away with income inequality and racism. And as far as income inequality goes, there was a really interesting study done by Columbia University. And it showed for every incremental increase in income that a family had, there was a corresponding increase in the surface area of children's brains, except when they hit middle class. If you gave them more money after that, the brains had already grown to their full potential, so it didn't matter. And the policy implications are profound. That means that money spent on the wealthiest families does very little to improve society, but that money spent on lower income families does a tremendous amount. We need a massive and transformational redistribution of wealth in this country in order to eradicate income inequality. One of the first things we can do is to have a federal livable living wage. And it has to be a minimum of $15 an hour, and not just state by state. It's got to be all throughout the country. That will do so much to lift families out of poverty. And the second thing, the Century Foundation did some work showing that a universal child allowance of $4,000 per child per year will lift multitudes of families out of poverty. The third thing we need to have a discussion about is we need to talk about reparations for slavery. For generations, black and brown American families have lived with a legacy of having had their wealth stolen from them for hundreds of years. People like me who live in a place of privilege have benefited from that, and the cumulative advantage in black and brown families is staggering. So how do we pay for these things? Well, we can look at the wealthiest individuals and families in the United States because they actually have more money now than they did before the banks crashed the economy in 2008. And those banks are actually bigger than they were then. So there's money. We can tax them more. We can put a Robin Hood tax, which would be a financial transaction tax, on all of the financial transactions on Wall Street, which would raise billions of dollars a year. But we need to go beyond simple cash. And we have to talk about the way we see ourselves in relation to other people. We have to have an intervention. We've got to talk about capitalism. Is this the world we were promised, and what can we do to make it more like that? We have to see ourselves differently, and we have to see others differently. My hope is when you leave today, the next time you see a person who looks homeless and they're on the street, you will have compassion and understanding that they are, and not act in a judgmental way thinking, how did they let themselves get that way? But you'll realize that if you're in a position of privilege, you and I are part of the reason they are that way. In fact, for every homeless person in the United States, there's 5 to 6 empty dwelling places. We don't have a housing shortage. We've got a compassion shortage. That's what this intervention has to be about. We've got to talk about it. We've got to talk about why we are okay with allowing our brothers and sisters not to have the basic necessities they need to reach their fullest potential, and why we are putting them in that state of chronic stress. I don't think that's easy work, but I do think we can do it. Americans are not afraid of hard work. And I think generations from now, people will look at us and they won't be able to imagine ever having lived in a society where the gap between rich and poor was this much. We can do this. I'll leave you with a thought. In 1987, David Bowie played a concert in West Berlin, right by the wall. And on the other side of the wall in East Berlin were the youth who were listening to the music that they weren't allowed to hear in East Berlin. He played the song Heroes, which is a song about triumph over adversity, the triumph of the human spirit. And when he began to play that song, they began to riot. Within a year and a half, that wall came down. When David Bowie died earlier this year, the German Foreign Office tweeted a thank you to him for his role in helping to build the momentum that brought down that wall. We need to bring down the wall of income inequality and of systemic and institutional racism, and we can do it. See, you never know where that spark is going to come from. It could come from a song, or a talk, or a conversation that you have with someone after you leave here today. But I believe it's going to happen, and I believe it's going to happen in our lifetimes. So let's begin. Thank you.